1. You read a chapter. 2. You highlight the important parts. 3. You review your notes repeatedly. 4. You still forget everything when it matters. Why? Because your brain doesn't actually form strong neural connections this way. Last semester, I spent 40 hours reviewing my biology notes, only to blank on test day. Sound familiar? Most traditional study methods fail because they don't align with how our brains actually store information. In this video, I'm revealing 3 science-backed techniques that dramatically improve information retention and recall. These methods, validated by cognitive research at leading universities, can transform ordinary students into learning machines. Get ready to completely transform how you learn forever. Why your current study methods are failing you. Have you ever spent hours reviewing your notes only to blank out during the test? You're not alone. That feeling of panic when information you swear you studied just vanishes from your brain during a crucial moment is a sign that your study methods aren't working. Let's talk about what most of us are doing when we study. Picture this. You're sitting at your desk, highlighter in hand, marking up important phrases in your textbook. Maybe you're recopying your notes to make them neater, or just reading the same chapter for the 3rd time. It feels productive, right? You're putting in the hours, seeing the pages turn, watching your notebook fill up with highlighted text. The problem is, all that effort is mostly wasted time. Your memory is like a leaky bucket. Passive studying pours information in, but without proper reinforcement, that knowledge steadily drains away before you need it. When you highlight text, reread notes, or passively review material, your brain isn't forming strong connections with that information. It's like looking at a map of a city versus actually walking the streets. You might recognize street names, but that doesn't mean you can navigate the city without help. When you simply reread information, your brain takes a shortcut. It recognizes the words and thinks, oh, I know this already, but doesn't actually work to store that information in long-term memory. This recognition versus recall problem is crucial. Recognition happens when you see information in your notes and your brain registers familiarity. Recall, what you need during a test, requires retrieving information without prompts. Consider your phone contacts. You recognize hundreds of names in your contact list, but how many phone numbers can you actually recall from memory? That's the difference between recognition and recall in action. The research confirms this problem. Studies show retention drops to about 20% after just 1 week when students use passive methods like rereading. For every hour spent studying this way, you're only retaining about 12 minutes worth of information. Here's the neurological explanation. When reviewing information passively, you're not forcing your neurons to build strong connections. It's like trying to make a path through tall grass by looking at it instead of repeatedly walking through to flatten it. Your brain forms stronger neural pathways when you actively engage with material, retrieving it, using it, connecting it to things you know. This explains why cramming sometimes helps you pass a test but leaves you clueless a week later. Cramming pushes information into short-term memory just long enough for recognition on a test, but without stronger neural connections, that information quickly fades. Like memorizing Spanish phrases for a test but being unable to order dinner in Mexico a month later. I used to think I was a good student because I could spend hours highlighting and rereading textbooks. My notes were color-coded, neat, and comprehensive. But when test time came, I'd freeze up on questions I swore I studied. It took years to realize I was confusing the feeling of productivity with actual learning. The personal frustration many of us experience with studying stems directly from what cognitive scientists have identified as an illusion of competence. This psychological phenomenon occurs when your brain gets satisfaction from recognizing information during review, mistaking that recognition for retrievable knowledge. It's comparable to watching a chef on TV and thinking, I could make that dish, versus actually cooking it yourself. Watching creates a feeling of competence, but the real test comes when you perform independently. This illusion of competence leads us to stop studying prematurely. We believe we've mastered material when we've only become familiar with it. It's like practicing a speech by reading it silently instead of rehearsing aloud. Completely different experiences with vastly different outcomes. Most of us were never taught effective study methods. The techniques we use, highlighting, rereading, making elaborate notes, are often passed down from equally uninformed teachers, parents, or peers. We're all playing tennis with incorrect form, wondering why we can't improve. Although learning science has advanced significantly in recent decades, this knowledge rarely reaches most classrooms or study guides. Research in cognitive psychology has revealed much about memory, yet most students still use outdated techniques. One revealing study asked students to predict their retention after using different study methods. Students consistently overestimated how much they'd recall after rereading, while underestimating recall after self-testing. Our learning intuitions are often completely backward. There's also something satisfying about the aesthetics of studying. Color-coded notes and organized study guides look impressive and photograph well for social media. But attractive materials don't automatically translate to knowledge. Think about how often you've reorganized your study space instead of actually studying, or spent time choosing perfect highlighter colors. We sometimes confuse the appearance of studying with genuine learning, like buying expensive workout clothes but never exercising. The learning myths holding you back. You know how we just talked about reorganizing your study space instead of actually studying? Well, the fancy Instagram word might be the least of your problems. What if I told you that the learning style you've identified with your entire life is about as scientific as your horoscope? And worse, it's actively putting a ceiling on how much you can actually learn. Think about it. How many times have you said, "I'm a visual learner," to explain why you prefer diagrams over text? Or maybe you've claimed to be an auditory learner who remembers lectures better than readings? I used to say this all the time. But here's the thing. Despite how intuitive it feels, the science says that's actually not a thing. This whole idea of learning styles has been completely debunked by decades of research, yet somehow, this myth is still everywhere. Teachers plan lessons around it, students identify with these labels, and educational products market to these supposed styles. The research is clear. Scientists have tried repeatedly to find evidence that matching teaching methods to someone's preferred learning style improves outcomes, and they haven't found it. They've looked for over 30 years, and instead of confirming the theory, they've proven it wrong. What works best is using different approaches based on what you're trying to learn. The problem with believing you're a visual learner is that it becomes a self-imposed limitation. If you think you can only learn effectively through diagrams, you might avoid methods that could actually work better for certain subjects. It's like showing up to a toolbox with only a hammer when sometimes you need a screwdriver. Another persistent myth is that we only use 10% of our brains. Total nonsense. Brain imaging studies show nearly all regions of the brain active during various learning activities. Different tasks activate different patterns, but there's no vast, untapped 90% just sitting there waiting to be accessed. This brain myth creates unrealistic expectations. Students think they have enormous, untapped potential. They just need to unlock somehow. It leads people to chase quick fixes instead of putting in the consistent work that actual learning requires. It's like expecting to find a secret passage in your house that doubles your living space when really you just need to organize what you already have. Connected to these is the multitasking myth that most of us believe. The idea that you can effectively study while checking Instagram, sending texts, and having Netflix on in the background is simply false. A 2016 study found that students spent a third of instructional time doing non-academic activities like playing games or shopping online, all while believing they were still processing the lesson. Your brain isn't handling multiple tasks simultaneously. It's rapidly switching between them. Each time you switch, there's a cognitive cost. You're never fully focused on either task, which means you're doing both worse than if you concentrated on one thing at a time. Think of it like trying to have two separate conversations at once. You'll miss important parts of both. A 2021 study demonstrated this clearly, finding that listening to music with lyrics while studying vocabulary creates an interference effect. Your brain struggles to process language from two sources at once. The result? Multitasking can reduce learning effectiveness by up to 40%. Imagine studying for 3 hours, but only getting the benefit of less than 2. That's what happens when you're constantly switching between your textbook and TikTok. Why do these myths persist if the science has debunked them? For one, they feel intuitive. If I enjoy diagrams more than reading text, it's easy to conclude that I must learn better that way. There's also comfort in these myths. It's easier to say I'm just not an auditory learner than to admit I need to work on my listening skills. Labels give us an excuse to avoid challenging ourselves in areas where we're weaker. Simple explanations are satisfying. It's easier to believe in a single learning style than to accept that effective learning is complex and requires different approaches for different situations. Educational companies also profit from these myths, selling specialized study materials and programs claiming to access that mythical 90% of your brain. The good news is that understanding these myths is liberating. Instead of limiting yourself to one approach, you can choose the best method for what you're trying to learn. Visual aids might work great for understanding spatial relationships, while verbal explanations might be better for abstract concepts. And instead of multitasking, you can focus deeply on one thing at a time, knowing you're getting the full benefit of your study session. It's like upgrading from dial-up internet to high-speed fiber. Suddenly everything works better. This doesn't mean you can't listen to music while studying. That 2021 study specifically found issues with music containing lyrics in a familiar language. Instrumental music might actually help some people focus by providing background noise that blocks out distractions. Active recall, the most powerful learning technique. While instrumental music might help you focus, let's talk about what actually helps with learning itself. Ever notice that uncomfortable feeling when you close your notes and try to remember what you just read? That struggle, that moment of your brain working harder to pull information from memory, isn't just uncomfortable. It's actually the secret to learning 3 times faster than your current approach. This magical technique is called active recall, and it completely flips traditional studying on its head. Instead of pushing information into your brain by reading and rereading, active recall is about pulling information out of your memory. Most of us spend hours trying to get information into our heads, but science shows the real learning happens when we force ourselves to retrieve that information. You might be thinking, testing myself sounds way harder than just reviewing my notes again. And you're right, it is harder. That's precisely why it works so much better. When you test yourself, you're strengthening the neural pathways in your brain that make information accessible later. Every time you successfully retrieve a fact or concept from memory, you're building a stronger connection to that information. I know it feels counterintuitive. Our instinct is to avoid that uncomfortable feeling of not immediately knowing an answer. We naturally gravitate toward what feels productive and comfortable, like highlighting, rereading, or making pretty notes. But that discomfort during active recall is actually a good sign. It means your brain is working harder, forming stronger connections, and creating more durable memories. The science behind this is fascinating. When you force your brain to retrieve information, you're simulating the exact same mental process you'll need during an exam or when applying knowledge in real life. It's like the difference between watching someone play basketball versus actually practicing shooting hoops yourself. Research backs this up powerfully. Studies show that students who use active recall significantly outperform those who rely on passive study techniques. In one study, students using active recall performed 50% better on exams than those using passive methods, even with less total study time. That potentially turns C grades into A's with the same or less time investment. Think about what that means for you. If you're currently spending 10 hours studying for an exam and getting average results, you could get much better results in 7 or 8 hours by changing how you study. Who wouldn't want that kind of return on investment? The effectiveness of active recall comes from how it strengthens neural pathways. Each time you retrieve information from memory, your brain paves a more direct route to that knowledge. The next time you need that information, the path is clearer and faster. This differs completely from passive review, where you might recognize information but can't produce it when needed. This technique works for virtually any subject: biology, history, mathematics, languages, and has been proven effective for all types of learners. Implementing active recall is straightforward. Create questions based on your study material and test yourself without looking at your notes. Instead of reading about the Civil War, ask yourself, what were the 3 main causes of the Civil War, and answer from memory. For math, solve practice problems without checking examples first. Active recall works beyond memorizing facts. Use it to test conceptual understanding with questions like, how would you explain this concept to someone else? Or how does this principle apply in this situation? This forces deeper information processing. When I first tried active recall, I was shocked by how much I didn't actually know. Concepts I thought I understood perfectly seemed fuzzy when I had to explain them without notes. It was humbling but transformed my study approach. I started spending less time highlighting and more time quizzing myself, and my grades improved significantly. A systematic review of peer-reviewed articles found that flashcards, a classic active recall tool, correlated with higher GPAs and test scores. Self-testing, retrieval practice, and concept mapping were all effective too, though many students underutilize these powerful techniques. What's surprising is how few students use active recall consistently, despite its proven effectiveness. Many of us never learned how to study properly. We were taught to read, highlight, and review, but rarely to test ourselves. It's like trying to build muscle by watching workout videos instead of actually lifting weights. Active recall also helps identify knowledge gaps. When you test yourself and can't remember something, that's valuable information. It shows exactly what to focus on next, rather than wasting time reviewing material you already know well. This targeted approach makes studying much more efficient. If you're wondering why this works so effectively, consider how active recall engages you with material at a deeper level. When just reading, it's easy to fall into autopilot mode. But when retrieving information from memory, your brain must actively work. The initial difficulty is exactly what makes it effective. Like lifting heavier weights builds stronger muscles, the mental effort required to pull information from memory strengthens neural connections. So next time you're studying and feel that struggle to remember something, don't get discouraged. That struggle is where the learning happens. How to implement active recall today. So you're convinced active recall works better than passive review, but now you're probably wondering, okay, but how do I actually do this with my biology textbook sitting in front of me? I'm about to show you a dead simple 3-step process that transforms any subject material into an active recall goldmine. The reason most students never implement active recall is surprisingly simple. They don't know how to start. It feels awkward at first, like trying to have a conversation with yourself. But once you see how straightforward it is, you'll wonder why you ever spent hours highlighting text that you'd never look at again. Think of this process like setting up a game of chess. First, you arrange the pieces, your questions, then you play the game, recalling answers, and finally, you analyze your moves. Check your work. Here's how it works. Step 1. Create meaningful questions from your material. Transform key concepts into questions that require deeper thinking. Example from biology. Instead of, what is photosynthesis? Ask, how would photosynthesis change if plants evolved on a planet with 2 suns? Or, how does photosynthesis relate to cellular respiration? Record questions separately from answers. Use a notebook with questions on the left page and answers on the right, or a digital document with answers on a separate page. Number each question with corresponding numbered answers. This creates an instant quiz format. Step 2. Answer from memory alone. Close your notes completely, no peeking. Write your answers thoroughly rather than just speaking them. This reveals knowledge gaps that verbal responses might hide. Make your best guess even when uncertain. That struggle strengthens neural pathways. Example. For the photosynthesis question, try explaining the light-dependent and light-independent reactions without referencing your textbook. Step 3. Check and color code your work. Mark correct answers in green, incorrect ones in red. This visual system shows exactly what you know and what needs work. It creates a satisfaction trigger when you see green marks. Identify patterns in what you consistently miss to target future study sessions. Focus your energy specifically on red-marked items in subsequent reviews. For math and science subjects, solve practice problems from scratch without looking at examples first. This forces your brain to construct solution pathways independently rather than just recognizing familiar steps. Beyond the basic process, try these additional methods. The teach someone else technique works wonders. Explain concepts to a friend, family member, or even an object. Software developers call this rubber ducking when they explain problems to desk toys. Verbalizing forces your brain to organize information coherently. Flashcards are effective when designed properly. Create cards that prompt thinking, not just fact recognition. Apps like Anki, Quizlet, or Remnote digitize this process. Use old quizzes as question banks. If your instructor provides practice tests, mine them for question formats and create additional similar questions. For essay-based subjects, draft questions requiring paragraph-length responses and write complete explanations from memory. Combining active recall with spaced repetition supercharges retention. Check your recall after increasingly longer intervals, 15 minutes, then 30, then an hour, and so on. This spacing dramatically improves long-term retention compared to cramming. When I started using active recall, I was shocked at how many obvious facts I couldn't remember without my notes. That initial discomfort drives the method's effectiveness. You're rebuilding information from scratch, not just recognizing it. The flexibility of active recall makes it applicable to any subject: history, languages, sciences, or professional certifications. The core process remains consistent across disciplines. Some students worry about the time investment, especially creating questions up front, but you're trading setup time for massive learning gains. Plus, those questions become reusable resources for future review. Imagine you have a biology exam next week. Instead of rereading the chapter multiple times, try this. Read once carefully. Create 20-30 conceptual questions. Close the book. Answer completely from memory. Check your work. Focus on missed concepts. Mental models. Repeat in a day or building knowledge frameworks. By test time, you'll be amazed at your confident recall. Active recall is just the first piece of the puzzle. You know how frustrating it is when you study hard for an exam, but still struggle to connect different concepts? That's because you're missing what experts in every field naturally develop. Mental frameworks that transform isolated facts into interconnected knowledge that sticks around for years, not just until the next test. Think about the last time you watched a doctor diagnose a patient on a medical show. While the medical student frantically flips through textbooks, the experienced physician quickly identifies the problem. This isn't because the doctor is smarter or has a better memory. They've built a mental model, an organized framework in their mind that works like an advanced filing system. When they observe symptoms, their brain automatically retrieves relevant files, cross-references connections between disorders, and quickly narrows down potential diagnoses. Mental models serve as your brain's knowledge organization system. Experts carefully categorize information into cabinets, folders, and files with clear labels and cross-references. When new information arrives, they immediately know where it belongs and how it connects to existing knowledge. What's fascinating is that experts across completely different fields use this same approach. Chess grandmasters, software engineers, and historians all organize information into comprehensive frameworks. Research shows this organization method allows them to process new information significantly faster than beginners. When I first learned about mental models, I was skeptical. It seemed like another vague learning concept that sounds good, but lacks practical value. However, the science behind this is remarkable. Studies demonstrate that students who actively build knowledge frameworks retain up to 3 times more information than those who memorize disconnected facts. That's the difference between an average grade and excelling on tests. Most of us approach learning by collecting random puzzle pieces without seeing the complete picture. We memorize that mitochondria power cells. World War I began in 1914, or force equals mass times acceleration, but fail to connect these facts to each other or the broader context. Consider the difference between memorizing 50 random street names versus learning a map with those streets connected in a logical pattern. The map approach is easier because your brain craves patterns and connections. Mental models provide the map rather than isolated street names. These mental frameworks function as scaffolding in your brain. New information has a place to connect, making it easier to remember. Understanding how cells generally work makes learning about specific cell types simpler, because you have an established framework to integrate that information. I witnessed this transformation with Maya, a struggling biology student I tutored. She initially memorized plant nutrition facts in isolation, but couldn't apply them to new questions. After we created visual concept maps connecting photosynthesis to cellular respiration and nutrient cycles, something clicked. During her next exam, she encountered questions about plant adaptations she'd never specifically studied, but her well-structured mental model allowed her to reason through the connections and correct answers. Her grade jumped from a C to an A, and more importantly, she developed genuine excitement about biology. The way experts build these models is fascinating. According to research, they demonstrate fast, fluid, and flexible responses to new information. Their brains automatically connect new information to the right places in their mental framework without conscious effort. Experts aren't born with these mental models. They develop them through reflective practice, actively thinking about how new information connects to existing knowledge. Anyone can learn this approach. Physics students who build mental models can visualize invisible forces like electromagnetism. The research describes these as internal thoughts that act as structural analogies, mental pictures representing complex relationships. This visualization helps them understand abstract concepts that aren't directly observable. Mental models improve both retention and application of knowledge. It's like understanding cooking principles versus memorizing recipes. Someone who memorizes recipes struggles when missing ingredients, while someone understanding fundamental principles can adapt and still create delicious meals. As we'll explore in upcoming sections, mental models don't just enhance academic performance, they transform how you approach real-world problems by helping you recognize underlying patterns across different situations. To start building these powerful mental frameworks, shift from collecting facts to constructing connections. When learning something new, ask yourself, how does this connect to what I already know? Where does this fit in the bigger picture? What would happen if this element changed? Drawing concept maps helps visualize these connections. Explaining concepts to others forces you to organize your knowledge coherently. Looking for patterns across examples builds the structure of your mental model. The best part? Unlike cramming for tests where information quickly fades, mental models grow stronger over time as you add connections and refine your understanding, creating a foundation for lifelong learning. Creating effective mental models, step by step. Ever notice how some people can explain complex ideas using simple diagrams that instantly make everything click? That's no accident. They're using specific mental modeling techniques that anyone can learn. While these mental frameworks naturally strengthen over time, you don't have to wait years to start thinking like an expert. There are actually 3 specific visualization techniques you can use today to transform how you structure information in your mind. Let me show you exactly how to build these mental models from scratch. I used to think creating mental models was a special talent reserved for experts, until I discovered there's a specific step-by-step process anyone can follow. The first technique is concept mapping, which organizes information by highlighting connections between ideas. Think of it like creating a roadmap of knowledge. When I first tried concept mapping for my biology class, I immediately spotted relationships I had completely missed before. To create one, start with your main concept in the center, like climate change. Then identify key related concepts such as greenhouse gases, global warming, and environmental policies. Draw lines connecting these to the main idea, adding brief explanations on each connecting line. The power lies in drawing connections between secondary concepts too, like linking greenhouse gases and environmental policies to show how regulations target emissions reduction. These cross connections transform a simple diagram into a mental model that reveals relationships most people overlook. Mind mapping works differently by organizing information radially. Your main idea sits at the center with branches radiating outward, main branches for subtopics, and smaller branches for specific details. The visual nature creates a clear mental framework, especially effective for subjects with many categories. For example, studying human anatomy might start with human body in the center, with main branches for each system, skeletal, muscular, nervous, and smaller branches extending to specific bone groups. Mind mapping mirrors how our brains naturally organize information in connected webs, rather than linear sequences. The Feynman technique takes a different approach by focusing on explanation rather than visualization. Named after physicist Richard Feynman, this method involves explaining complex topics in simple terms, as if teaching a child. Here's the process. Choose a concept, then write everything you know about it using simple language without jargon. When you struggle to explain something simply, you've identified a gap in your understanding. Go back to your sources, learn more about that specific area, then try explaining it again. This technique works by forcing you to identify essential components and clarify confusion points. These three techniques differ in important ways. Concept mapping emphasizes relationships between ideas with a network structure. Mind mapping organizes hierarchical information in a radial pattern. The Feynman technique uses simple explanation to identify and fill knowledge gaps. What makes these approaches powerful is that they transform how you think about subjects. They create cognitive frameworks that guide understanding and decision-making. School leaders use similar models to establish shared expectations, like creating a common framework for what excellent teaching looks like. Building mental models is a cyclical process. In science education, students construct, express, test, and restructure their mental models against reference models. Think about how your understanding of photosynthesis evolved from plants use sunlight to make food to including details about chlorophyll, carbon dioxide, and glucose production. Creating mental models requires more upfront effort than memorizing facts, but the payoff is substantial. New information has somewhere to stick in your mind, making both learning and recall easier. I experienced this studying biochemistry. The Krebs cycle seemed like an impossible sequence to memorize until I visualized it as a factory production line with each enzyme as a worker. Suddenly, disconnected facts became a logical process. Think of these three techniques as different tools in your mental modeling toolkit. Like assembling a puzzle, each method helps you piece together understanding in different ways. Concept mapping shows how pieces connect, mind mapping organizes them hierarchically, and the Feynman technique ensures each piece is thoroughly understood. To create effective mental models, start by identifying core concepts. For example, core concepts of the American Civil War might include states' rights, slavery, economic differences, and westward expansion. Then visualize these concepts and their connections. Ask yourself how new concepts connect to what you already know and what patterns emerge. For complex topics, try using analogies to connect new concepts to familiar ones. When learning about the immune system, I compared it to a country's defense system. White blood cells as soldiers, skin as a wall, antibodies as specialized weapons. The beauty of these mental modeling techniques is that you can combine them. Use concept mapping for relationships, mind mapping for organization, and the Feynman technique for deep understanding. Compressed learning, simplifying the complex. While mental models organize information beautifully, they don't solve one major problem: information overload. Have you ever noticed how some people seem to master complex subjects in half the time it takes everyone else? They're not studying more, they're actually focusing on less. This counterintuitive approach targets just the most essential principles and creates a foundation that makes everything else click into place faster. Think about your working memory like a desk. There's only so much space to spread out papers before things start falling off. Cognitive load theory shows us that our brains have strict limits on how much new information they can process at once. When we try to learn everything simultaneously, we overwhelm this limited mental workspace and end up with fragmented understanding. This is where compressed learning comes in. It's a technique that helps you identify the vital 20% of concepts that explain 80% of a subject. The approach works similarly to how computers compress large files. When you zip a folder, the computer looks for patterns and redundancies, then creates a more efficient version containing all the essential information. Your brain works this way when learning complex topics, identifying patterns and core principles that make everything else make sense. Compressed learning is grounded in cognitive science research about how our brains process information. Sweller and colleagues found that by managing cognitive load effectively, we can dramatically improve learning outcomes. When we align our study methods with how our brains naturally process information, we learn much more efficiently. Let me break this down with an example. Imagine you're trying to learn programming. There are hundreds of commands, functions, and syntax rules to memorize. A typical student might try to learn everything at once, creating massive cognitive overload. But someone using compressed learning would focus first on understanding core concepts like variables, loops, conditionals, and functions. Once these fundamental building blocks are solid, learning all the specific syntax becomes easier because they have a framework to connect this new information to. This approach is based on the Pareto principle, that famous 80-20 rule. Vilfredo Pareto originally observed that 80% of Italy's wealth belonged to 20% of the population, but this pattern shows up everywhere. In business, 20% of clients often generate 80% of revenue. In your daily life, you might notice that you wear 20% of your clothes 80% of the time. Similarly, mastering the core 20% of concepts gives you 80% of the understanding you need. I experienced this firsthand when teaching myself data science. After weeks of struggling with various algorithms and techniques, I stepped back and focused solely on understanding statistical distributions and probability fundamentals. Within days, concepts that had seemed impenetrable suddenly became clear. This focused approach cut my learning time dramatically while deepening my understanding. The beauty of compressed learning is its universal application. In statistics, once you understand sampling, probability, and hypothesis testing, all the specific tests become easier to grasp. In chemistry, mastering periodic table patterns and basic bonding principles makes memorizing reactions straightforward. The trick is identifying those key principles that everything else builds upon. Most students don't learn this way because traditional education often presents all information as equally important. Open any textbook and you'll see chapters packed with facts, formulas, and definitions, all presented with the same emphasis. Students get overwhelmed without clear guidance on what's truly fundamental versus supplementary detail. Research shows students who first master core principles can learn advanced material up to 3 times faster than those who don't. This potentially cuts study time by 2/3 while actually improving understanding. It's about studying smarter, not harder. Compressed learning works with your brain's natural tendencies as a pattern recognition machine. When you understand foundational patterns in a subject, your brain more easily processes, stores, and retrieves related information. It's like having a mental filing system where everything has a logical place. This connects directly to what cognitive scientists categorize as intrinsic, extraneous, and germane cognitive load. Intrinsic load comes from inherent complexity. Extraneous load comes from poor instruction. Germane load is beneficial. It builds meaningful connections and mental models. Compressed learning reduces extraneous load by focusing only on what matters initially, manages intrinsic load by breaking complex topics into manageable chunks, and maximizes germane load by creating strong connections between core concepts. This balanced approach respects working memory limitations while maximizing learning efficiency. Expert learners aren't necessarily smarter in a general sense. They have well-developed mental frameworks that let them process new information efficiently, quickly identifying what's essential because they understand the underlying patterns of knowledge structure. The approach might initially seem counterintuitive because it feels like you're learning less. What you're actually doing is creating a stronger foundation that makes all subsequent learning faster and more efficient, like ensuring a house has a solid foundation before building walls and roof. Implementing compressed learning techniques. Those students transform their learning by focusing on fundamentals. But here's the tricky part: identifying which 20% of information actually matters. You know that feeling when you're drowning in study material, having no idea what's essential? Let me show you how to cut through that confusion with a technique so simple, you'll be shocked nobody taught it to you before. I want to share something that completely changed how I approach learning new subjects. Remember when we talked about how experts can quickly identify what matters most? They use specific methods to separate the essential from the supplementary. And you can do exactly the same thing. Let's talk about the Explain Like I'm 5 method, or ELI5 for short. This technique forces you to strip away fancy terminology and complicated details to focus on the absolute core of what makes a concept work. When you try explaining something complex in simple terms, you quickly discover whether you truly understand it. Next time you're learning something complicated, try explaining it out loud as if you're talking to a child. If you can't do it clearly and simply, that's a huge red flag that you don't understand the fundamental principle yet. I noticed this with advanced math concepts. When I can explain calculus using everyday language and examples, I know I've mastered it rather than just memorized steps. For instance, with photosynthesis, you'd focus on plants take sunlight, water, and air to make their food, not on the detailed biochemical pathways. The relief students feel when they successfully break down complex biological processes this way is incredible. Suddenly, the overwhelming textbook chapters feel manageable. Another approach is creating simplified summaries before diving into details. Most students make the mistake of trying to absorb every single detail from day one. Instead, skim through material first to identify recurring themes and principles, then create a basic framework outlining these core concepts. This method aligns with how our brains actually learn. When you create a simplified model first, you're giving your brain a framework to attach new information to. It's like building the skeleton of a house before adding the walls, plumbing, and electrical work. When I started learning cognitive psychology, I was overwhelmed by theories, experiments, and terminology. Then I created a simple model focusing on 3 core processes: how we perceive information, how we store it, and how we retrieve it. Suddenly, all those complex theories had somewhere to connect, and learning became much faster. This works because it aligns with cognitive load theory. Our working memory can only handle a limited amount of new information at once. By simplifying complex topics first, you work within those natural limitations instead of fighting against them. You can apply this approach to any subject. In mathematics, start by mastering fundamental formulas. For languages, focus initially on common words and basic grammar patterns. That's your 20% that enables 80% of communication. In history, look for key themes and causal relationships rather than memorizing countless dates. In science classes, understand fundamental laws first, like Newton's laws of motion or basic thermodynamics, before tackling complex applications. These principles serve as the foundation that makes everything else make sense. What's fascinating is how experts identify what's important. They look for recurring themes that appear throughout a subject. These repeated patterns usually signal the core concepts. When instructors emphasize certain ideas repeatedly, that's often part of your critical 20. Another effective strategy is identifying concepts that connect multiple ideas. These integrating concepts deserve most of your attention. In biology, evolution connects countless observations about species diversity, adaptation, and genetic variation. Understanding evolution deeply makes many other biological concepts clearer. One of my students transformed her organic chemistry experience by focusing on reaction mechanisms rather than memorizing dozens of individual reactions. By understanding these fundamental patterns, she could predict molecular interactions instead of memorizing each possibility. Her grades improved dramatically, and she experienced that wonderful aha moment when the subject finally clicked. This approach feels counterintuitive because we've been taught that good students learn everything equally well. But research shows students who master core principles first learn advanced material significantly faster than those trying to memorize everything equally. Think about how computers compress files by identifying patterns and redundancies. Your brain works similarly when you focus on core principles first. You're creating a compressed version of knowledge that's easier to work with. The beautiful thing about this method is that it creates a foundation, making additional learning faster and more efficient. Once you understand the core 20%, the remaining 80% connects to your existing framework, becoming meaningful rather than overwhelming. This doesn't mean ignoring details entirely. Details matter, but the order in which you learn makes a huge difference. By mastering core principles first, the 3X framework, combining all those details, context, and meaning. The 3X framework integrating active recall, mental models, and compressed learning into one system. Now, that's where the real magic happens. I've discovered something fascinating. When you use these techniques individually, they're powerful, but when you combine them in the right sequence, something extraordinary happens. When I first started researching accelerated learning, I noticed most people pick just one method and wonder why they don't see dramatic results. The real power comes from the synergy. These techniques function like a well-tuned engine where each component amplifies the others, creating momentum that propels your learning forward. What makes the 3X framework truly effective is creating a feedback loop where each step enhances the next. Think of it as a learning ecosystem rather than isolated tactics. Let me walk you through how this works in practice. 1. Compressed learning, identifying the core 20% that delivers 80% of understanding. Focus on fundamental principles that form the skeleton of knowledge. For psychology learners, this means understanding basic paradigms like behaviorism and cognitivism before specific studies. Research shows this initial compression prevents the overwhelm that causes 67% of students to abandon complex subjects. 2. Mental models, building connections between core concepts. Create networks of understanding rather than isolated facts. In psychology, connect how behaviorism influenced cognitivism or how humanistic approaches responded to earlier theories. Studies demonstrate students using this connection technique retain information 2.4x longer than traditional memorization methods. What happens in your brain? You create rich neural networks with multiple retrieval paths. 3. Active recall, testing yourself on principles and connections. This strengthens your entire mental framework, not just isolated facts. For psychology students, explain how different paradigms would approach the same problem. Test results show students using this technique score 35% higher on application-based exams. Each test identifies knowledge gaps, sending you back to refine your understanding. How does this cycle create such powerful results? Each pass through the framework strengthens your knowledge and accelerates subsequent learning. It's like compound interest for your brain. The returns accelerate over time. What separates this approach from traditional study methods? The 3X framework develops deeper, more flexible understanding that you can actually apply, rather than brittle knowledge you can recite but not use. Consider this practical example. When helping a struggling medical student with anatomy, we applied the 3X framework. First, we focused on fundamental principles of anatomical organization. Then we built mental models connecting structures based on function and location. Finally, we used active recall to test understanding. The result? She improved her exam scores by 27% and could apply this knowledge in clinical scenarios where traditional memorization had failed. Why does this approach work so effectively? Each technique addresses a different learning challenge. Compressed learning prevents overwhelm by focusing on core principles. Mental models create meaningful connections, aiding understanding. Active recall strengthens memory and identifies knowledge gaps. Does the sequence matter? Absolutely. Starting with active recall before building mental models would mean testing yourself on disconnected facts. Similarly, building mental models without first identifying core principles would create confusion rather than clarity. I've witnessed remarkable transformations through this framework. An engineering student drowning in formulas first identified fundamental laws of thermodynamics, compressed learning, created concept maps showing relationships between equations, mental models, and used practice problems to test understanding, active recall. Within 3 weeks, he improved from a C to an A, solving complex problems that stumped classmates. This synergistic effect produces the 3x acceleration in learning speed. You're not just learning faster, you're creating understanding that's deeper and more durable. While the framework applies universally, implementation varies by subject. Compressed learning for languages might focus on high-frequency vocabulary, while history might emphasize key causal relationships. The consistent approach: identify core principles, build connections, and test understanding of both. What makes this framework increasingly valuable? It gets easier and more effective with use. As your mental models strengthen in one area, connecting new information becomes natural. Your brain improves at pattern recognition, and active recall becomes second nature through practice. Real-world examples across different subjects. While this framework becomes second nature with practice, what if I told you it works just as well for calculus as it does for French? Most people think math and languages need totally different learning approaches, but they're missing something obvious. The 3x framework isn't a one-size-fits-all technique that you apply identically to every subject. Instead, it's more like a universal recipe that you season differently depending on what you're cooking. Let's break down how this works in real subjects. In mathematics, you're dealing with a subject built on logic and problem solving. When you apply compressed learning to math, you're focusing on mastering foundational formulas and theorems first. Instead of memorizing every calculus formula, you prioritize understanding fundamental concepts like limits, derivatives, and integrals. A student I worked with was struggling with calculus until she realized she needed to build a strong foundation with core formulas. She created a simple cheat sheet with essential theorems and practiced applying them to different problems. This compressed approach prevented her from being overwhelmed by formula variations. For mental models in math, you visualize concept connections. You might create a diagram showing how algebraic principles connect to geometric proofs, or map how different calculus concepts relate. The goal is seeing math as an interconnected system rather than isolated formulas. Active recall in math involves solving problems without examples. When you work through a problem step by step without looking at notes, you strengthen neural pathways. Each time you struggle through a math problem from memory, you build stronger connections. Now let's see how this applies to language learning. Here, compressed learning means focusing on frequently used vocabulary and grammar patterns. Mastering just 1,000 well-chosen words can understand about 80% of everyday conversations in most languages. I spoke with a Japanese language learner who spent 6 months memorizing obscure vocabulary before realizing she couldn't handle basic conversations. When she switched to high-frequency words and essential grammar patterns, her progress accelerated dramatically. For mental models in languages, you create maps connecting grammar patterns and vocabulary usage. Understanding how verb conjugations relate to sentence structure helps you see patterns rather than memorizing endless verb forms. You build a framework that makes placing new words and concepts easier. Active recall in language learning is contextual, recalling vocabulary and phrases in real situations. You might practice explaining yesterday's activities entirely in French, or write a short story using specific grammar patterns in Spanish. This makes retrieval more natural when actually using the language. Would you believe history and science can be approached similarly? In history, compressed learning identifies key themes, significant events, and causal relationships. For mental models, timeline-based frameworks help visualize event sequences and interconnections. Active recall involves explaining historical events and their connections from memory. Science subjects benefit enormously from this approach, too. In compressed learning for science, you master fundamental laws and principles first, like Newton's laws or natural selection principles. For mental models, you visualize system interactions through diagrams. Active recall involves explaining processes and solving problems from memory. The beauty of this approach is that while specific techniques vary by subject, the core principles remain consistent. You always identify essential information, create frameworks to connect that information, and test your ability to retrieve and apply it. What's fascinating is how these subject-specific applications cross-pollinate. Once you excel at building mental models in math, that skill transfers when learning science concepts. The active recall techniques developed for language learning help when studying history. I had a student struggling with both organic chemistry and Spanish vocabulary until she realized she could apply similar principles to both. For chemistry, she focused on reaction mechanisms rather than memorizing individual reactions. For Spanish, she prioritized high-frequency vocabulary. In both cases, she identified the 20% of information that would give her 80% of results. Another student was learning piano and calculus simultaneously. By creating visual mental models for both, mapping chord progressions for music and graphing functions for calculus, he better understood patterns in both subjects. The same approach worked across these seemingly unrelated fields. The framework becomes increasingly powerful as you apply it across multiple subjects because you're building general learning abilities, not just subject-specific knowledge. It's like working out. The more you exercise these learning muscles, the stronger they get, regardless of the specific exercise you're doing. Overcoming challenges and measuring progress. Those learning muscles we're building, they're going to feel pretty sore at first. When you switch from passive reviewing to active recall, it's normal to feel like you're suddenly worse at learning. But what if I told you that feeling of struggle is actually the best indicator that you're finally learning properly? There's a reason scientists call it desirable difficulty, and tracking your progress will prove it. Let's talk about something that happens to almost everyone who tries these techniques. You start using active recall instead of rereading your notes, and suddenly studying feels harder. You're spotting gaps in your knowledge that you never noticed before. You might think, I was doing better with my old way. This reaction is common, and it's a good sign. Your brain is finally doing the work needed to form strong memories. Desirable difficulty means that when learning feels challenging, it's creating stronger memory connections, like how lifting heavier weights builds more muscle than lifting light ones. When you start a new workout routine, you wake up feeling sore, right? Your brain experiences similar discomfort when switching to effective learning methods. That initial struggle indicates your brain is actively engaging with the material in ways it wasn't before. The struggle itself makes these techniques powerful. Many students give up right when they should push through. They try active recall once, struggle to retrieve information they thought they knew, and return to comfortable but ineffective highlighting. It's like quitting the gym after one workout because of muscle soreness. Start small instead. Use active recall for just 15 minutes initially. Your mental stamina will build over time, just like physical endurance. Begin with one concept or a single textbook section. As you get comfortable with temporary discomfort, gradually extend sessions to 25 minutes, then 45 minutes. How do you know if you're actually improving? Tracking becomes essential. Without measuring progress, it's easy to get discouraged and revert to passive habits. Here are effective ways to track your progress. Test yourself at specific intervals after 1 day, 3 days, a week, and 2 weeks. This strengthens memory through spaced repetition, a technique proven by decades of cognitive research while showing clear evidence of improving retention. Keep a simple learning journal to record which techniques work best for different materials. You might discover concept mapping works for biology but needs adjustment for history, or flashcards excel for vocabulary but require modification for physics formulas. Measure effectiveness by recall quality, not study time. Track how much information you can accurately recall without notes. That's the real measure of learning. Create a knowledge confidence chart. List key concepts and rate your confidence, explaining each from 1 to 5. Watch these ratings improve as you continue using active techniques. The key is measuring progress appropriately. Don't track time spent studying. I studied for 4 hours. That's like measuring a workout by gym time rather than strength gains. Instead, assess how well you can explain topics without references. Try this. After studying, score yourself from 1 to 10 on how well you can explain a concept without notes. Repeat a week later. As you continue with these techniques, you'll see scores improving even as study time decreases. When tracking this way, patterns emerge. You'll notice topics needing more attention or techniques that work better for different subjects. This metacognition, thinking about your thinking, is what top students do naturally. What's fascinating is that even though active recall feels harder, your retention rates will be significantly higher. A test that might have taken 4 passive review sessions might only require 2 active recall sessions. Your efficiency improves dramatically. I experienced this in my biochemistry class. Initial active recall sessions were painful. I realized I couldn't explain enzyme kinetics as well as I thought. But after pushing through that discomfort, I could remember complex pathways weeks later without constant review. The material actually stayed in my brain. Passive learning methods are like using a leaky bucket to carry water. You keep pouring information in, but most drains out before reaching your destination. Active recall fixes those leaks. It feels harder because you're finally aware of how much you were losing before. During this transition, combine progress tracking with small rewards. When you see retention improving on your tracking chart, celebrate that win. Even a favorite snack or short break doing something enjoyable can help associate challenging techniques with positive feelings. Early results might not seem dramatic, but learning improvements compound over time. As you build stronger mental models and effective study habits, each new piece of information connects to something solid. Modest improvements snowball into dramatic differences in learning capacity. Most people never push through the initial discomfort phase. By persisting through this adjustment period, you're already ahead of most students. Remember that self-testing is both a learning technique and a measurement tool, simultaneously strengthening memory and tracking progress. All right, it's time to make a real change in how you learn. The research is clear. This 3X framework transforms your approach to learning. Here's what I want you to do right now. Pick one topic you're currently studying. Just one small chunk. Apply the framework, compress it to core principles, build connections, and test yourself without notes. Don't wait. Try it today and watch your comprehension instantly improve. One student used this on a biology chapter and jumped from a C to an A overnight. Share your success stories in the comments. This simple shift will revolutionize how your brain retains information.